From their perspective, the reason was that Christianity was a giant obstacle to their plans. You couldn't eliminate private property when God said, "Thou shalt not steal." You can't steal people's stuff if everybody believes that it's a divine decree that you not steal people's stuff.
It strikes me that the more we pour into the schools to try and fix them, all we're doing is strengthening and repairing a machine that's already doing what it's supposed to do. So we can only make it worse by trying to reform the system. It really is time to start from scratch. And that foundation you mentioned was that ultimately parents are responsible, and parents should be the primary educators of our kids. So it also strikes me that we need to be very careful as Christians when we lean toward the idea of Christian education in general, that we're not replacing the broken public school system with the Christian model of that. We need to be careful that parents are still the primary educators, and that the foundations of that don't model after this thing that we know doesn't work for our nation. You have talked about Robert Owen and you glossed over John Dewey a little bit. Go back to the beginning and tell us who the people were who put this into play and what was their motivation. I know you've said Robert Owen meant to undermine the Christian faith. Go into that a little further.
Yeah, happy to do it. And I think Robert Owen is such an important historical figure, and he's almost completely unknown today. It's just very, very bizarre to me that such an important historical figure has been erased from our history books. But so Robert Owen he was born in Wales. He married into a very wealthy industrial family that operated a textile operation. And he ended up taking over the textile operation. So he became very wealthy. And he had these very bizarre ideas for social reform. Of course, he rejected Christianity, which led to very seriously flawed conclusions, like, oh, we don't need all this family stuff. Oh, we don't need this private property stuff. To his credit, he was a true believer. A lot of the people who push these crazy ideas, they don't believe in this stuff, and they just see it as a means to expand their own power, their own wealth, their own control. It does seem to me like Robert Owen genuinely believed this silly stuff would work. And I say that because he actually bought a piece of land in Indiana and started a commune to kind of show how great these ideas would be. It's probably needless to say, but it failed very, very rapidly. It didn't even last for a whole 2 years. But what he wanted to do was try to show that we really didn't need families. And even before he started the commune, he was working on these things. So one of the things that he did with his textile operation was try out this new idea of, hey, let's get the kids from their parents really, really early and see if we can get them to think more like little collectivists. He wanted to pry these children loose from their parents at 2 years old and get them into these kind of daycare facilities. This was way before daycare was a real thing. So they started doing this, and they started doing these weird social experiments. Eventually that culminated with this compound. Now, Robert Owen wrote a lot. He had all these different essays on his view about how government should operate. He ultimately wanted to eliminate private property. He wanted to sideline parents and have children raised by the collective. Of course, two full frontal assaults on God's divinely ordained order for human life, etc. So he fails with this commune, but he comes to the conclusion that the reason it failed is not because he was rejecting biblical principles. The reason it failed is because these children who then became adults had been raised in an individualistic environment. That's a term you hear a lot with all these guys who are responsible for creating the school, the individualism, right? We got to reduce the individualism. So he set out to change this by having the government get involved in education. Now, I think for people today, that doesn't seem all that radical. For people 200 years ago when he was doing this, that was extremely radical. Government had essentially no role at all in education. Primarily, it was parents, and then to the extent that parents needed or wanted any help, they would go to the church, they would go to their neighbors, they would go to their extended family. There was no role for government to speak of. So he sets up what a whistleblower later described as a secret society. It's very, very interesting, this story, almost entirely unknown. But one of the guys who was involved with this secret society, Orestes Brownson was his name, he was very committed to this cause. He was actually organizing a part of New York State for this cause. And he said the twin objectives, on the surface at least, were changing public opinion, right? They wanted to go out and teach people why government ought to be involved in education. And then they wanted to get men elected to the legislatures of the states who would also support at least the camel's nose under the tent, right? They didn't come out and say, hey, we want your kids for 9 months for 7 hours a day. But just let the government have a little role. And then, so Orestes Brownson eventually becomes a Catholic, and he repents of his involvement in this wickedness and decides to blow the whistle. He writes a whole book about it. Wow. And he says that the ultimate objective The end goal of this, in his words, was to destroy, to eliminate Christianity. And he says, we weren't going to say that openly, right? But what we wanted, he says, was a system of state and then national education whereby we could exclude everything that couldn't be verified by the census. And he said, we wouldn't directly attack the clergy, but we would bring them into contempt and ridicule them wherever we could. So that was the end goal. Now, why did they want to eliminate Christianity? Well, probably because they were serving Satan. But from their perspective, the reason was that Christianity was a giant obstacle to their plans. You couldn't eliminate private property when God said, thou shalt not steal. You can't steal people's stuff if everybody believes that it's a divine decree that you not steal people's stuff. You can't dismantle the family as long as people believe it's a divinely ordained institution. So that's why they wanted that idea. Now, the history here gets really interesting. According to Robert Owen, and it gets very hard to track, secret society. Brownson said it was based on the Carbonari of Europe. But the ambassador for the dictator of Prussia gets a hold of these essays that Robert Owen had been writing. And he, according to Robert Owen, so much approved of these ideas. He was still smarting from losing a war with Napoleon. Things weren't going well in Prussia. They thought maybe if I could just get more obedient serfs, maybe if they would just, obey me without question, then maybe I wouldn't have lost that war. So he tells his interior minister, hey, take these documents, set up a school based on this, and that is the first system we can find anywhere of education of the state, by the state, for the state. And then that gets re-imported into the United States by another man who rejected Christianity. He was a Unitarian by the name of Horace Mann. Now, I can't directly trace the secret society to Horace Mann, but the principles are exactly the same. Horace Mann studied the Prussian system, and then his goal was to bring that into Massachusetts. That's exactly what he did.
This episode of Rapid Response was brought to you by CTC Math. Visit them at ctcmath.com today.